beneath your feet. Right now, beneath every forest on Earth, something is moving. Slowly, quietly, through the dark. Welcome to the Sleepy Lab. Tonight, we are going underground, into the hidden world beneath the trees, where roots and fungi have been whispering to each other for longer than most life on land has existed. You will drift through ancient partnerships, quiet exchanges, and a kind of connection that has no name in any human language. If this is the kind of journey you want more of, consider subscribing, one sleepy soul at a time. Now, let's begin. Close your eyes and picture a forest. Not the trees you can see, not the light falling through the canopy, or the sound of wind in the leaves. Picture what is underneath, beneath the moss, beneath the leaf litter, beneath the first cold layer of soil, a network of threads, impossibly fine, spreading in every direction. This is where the forest's real life happens. Every healthy forest floor holds within it a web of fungal threads, woven between the roots of hundreds of trees. These threads connect oak to oak, fir to fir, birch to pine. They carry carbon and minerals and chemical signals through the dark, from one root system to another, across distances a tree could never reach on its own. This network has a popular name. Scientists coined it in a paper published in the journal Nature in 1997. They called it the Wood Wide Web. The name has a certain charm, but the reality beneath it is older and quieter and more patient than any metaphor we might reach for. The threads themselves are called mycelium. Mycelium is the vegetative body of a fungus, not the mushroom you might see above ground, but the living structure beneath it, fine as spider silk. Finer? Sometimes. A single teaspoon of healthy forest soil can hold several kilometers of these threads, coiled and branching through the dark in every direction. Several kilometers in a teaspoon of soil. Sit with that for a moment. The fungi that form these networks are called mycorrhizal fungi. The word comes from the Greek, mykes, meaning fungus, and rhiza, meaning root, fungus root, a union described in the name itself. And it is a union, not a coincidence, not an accident of proximity. Roughly 90% of all land plant species on Earth have formed partnerships with mycorrhizal fungi. 90%. That is not a niche relationship. That is the foundation of how plants live on land. These partnerships are estimated to be at least 450 million years old. 450 million years. The oldest forests we know of are perhaps 350 million years old. These fungal relationships predate them. They may have made them possible. Early land plants, moving from water onto bare rock, may have been able to survive that difficult transition partly because of their fungal partners, the fungi reaching into the rock, pulling out minerals, delivering them to roots that could not yet manage alone. The forest, in a sense, was built on this relationship before the forest existed. There are two main kinds of mycorrhizal fungi, and they work in different ways. The first kind, called ectomycorrhizal fungi, are common in the temperate forests of the northern hemisphere, the forests of fir and beech and oak. These fungi wrap themselves around the outside of root tips, forming a visible sheath, a soft sleeve of fungal tissue around each root end. They do not enter the root cells. They embrace them from outside. The second kind are older. Arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi are more ancient still, and they work differently. They grow inside the root cells themselves, branching within the cell walls in delicate tree-like structures called arbuscules. These fungi are found in tropical forests, in grasslands, and the roots of most of the flowering plants on Earth. Two strategies, both ancient, both quietly sustaining the world above them. The exchange at the heart of these partnerships is simple to describe, though the chemistry behind it is not. The tree, through photosynthesis, captures sunlight and turns it into sugar. Some of that sugar, up to 30% of everything the tree produces, flows down through the roots and into the fungal network. The fungus receives it, uses it, lives on it. In return, the fungus delivers what the tree cannot easily find on its own: phosphorus, nitrogen, water. The fungal threads are far thinner than roots, and they can push through tiny pores in the soil that roots cannot enter. They reach further, probe deeper, access pockets of mineral wealth that would otherwise remain locked away. The tree makes light into sugar. The fungus turns soil into nutrition. Each gives what the other cannot make. This arrangement has persisted, more or less unchanged, for nearly 500 million years, through ice ages and mass extinctions, through the rise and fall of entire ecosystems. This quiet trade has continued, sugar flowing down, minerals flowing up in the dark, without pause. And the network that grows from these partnerships is not simply a collection of separate pairs. It is a web, a true web, connecting not just one tree to one fungus, but hundreds of trees to each other through shared fungal threads that run between their roots like slow rivers underground. Carbon fixed by one tree on a Monday morning can appear in the roots of a neighboring tree by Wednesday. This has been confirmed, not imagined, not inferred, but measured, using radioactive carbon tracers and controlled forest experiments. The carbon moves, it travels, it arrives. The direction of that flow is not random. It shifts with the seasons. It shifts with the needs of individual trees. A seedling growing in deep shade, starved of sunlight, unable to photosynthesize enough to sustain itself. That seedling receives more carbon from the network than a seedling growing in open light. The network, in some quiet way, notices who needs more. And at the center of these networks, in the oldest forests, there are certain trees, the largest, the oldest, the ones that have been standing for decades, sometimes centuries, building connections year by year, thread by thread, until their root systems are woven into the network more deeply than any other. These are sometimes called mother trees or hub trees. The names point to the same thing, a tree that sits at the center of a web of connections, linked to hundreds of others, sending resources outward through the fungal threads in quantities that smaller, younger trees cannot match. A single mother tree can be connected to hundreds of other trees at once, and the carbon and nutrients she sends through the network do not flow equally in all directions. They flow measurably, preferentially toward her own offspring. But that is a story for a little later in the night. For now, simply rest with this. Beneath every forest, in the dark, in the cold, in the quiet, a network older than the trees themselves is at work. Threads finer than hair, carrying sugar and minerals and something that functions, at least, like care. The forest above is many trees. The forest below is one. The fungal threads that carry all of this are almost impossibly fine. A tree root, even a young and slender one, is thick compared to the threads of mycelium winding through the soil around it. Fungal threads are so narrow that they can slip into spaces a root could never reach. Tiny pores between grains of soil, hairline gaps in crumbling rock, the microscopic corridors of the underground world that roots simply pass by. This is why the partnership works. The tree, with its broad leaves and its long hours in the light, is very good at making sugar. Photosynthesis, sunlight converted into carbon, carbon built into the molecules that feed the tree and everything connected to it. But the tree's roots, for all their reach, are too large to mine, the soil at its finest scale. The fungus has no leaves. It cannot make its own food from light, but it can go where roots cannot. It threads itself through the smallest passages in the soil, finding phosphorus locked in mineral grains, drawing nitrogen from pockets too narrow for any root to enter, reaching water in places the tree would otherwise go without. And so they trade. Sugar flows down from the canopy, through the trunk, through the roots, and out into the fungal threads. Minerals and water flow back the other way. The tree feeds the fungus feeds the tree. This division of labor, one partner gathering light, the other mining stone, has been running without interruption for at least 450 million years. long before there were forests, long before there were flowers, or birds, or anything that breathed with lungs. The partnership is older than almost everything we would recognize as life on land. And it has lasted because it works. But it is worth pausing here, because the exchange is not simply automatic. It is not a passive drip of resources from one organism to another. Both partners are, in some sense, paying attention. A tree can reduce the flow of carbon it sends to a fungal partner that is not delivering enough in return. If the fungus is taking sugar but withholding phosphorus, providing less than the tree needs, the tree adjusts. The flow slows. The partnership is renegotiated, quietly, in the dark. The fungus can do the same. A fungal network that is not receiving sufficient sugar from a tree can withhold phosphorus from that tree's roots. It can redirect its resources toward other partners that are contributing more. This mutual regulation, each partner monitoring what it gives and what it receives, each capable of adjusting the terms, is what makes the relationship something more than parasitism. A parasite takes. This is something else, something closer to an arrangement, maintained over time by both parties. A single large tree is rarely connected to just one fungal species. It may be linked to dozens simultaneously, each species with its own strengths, its own reach, its own specialization in the soil. Some are better at delivering phosphorus. Others are more efficient with nitrogen. Some extend deeper into the soil. Others spread wider near the surface. The tree, connected to all of them at once, draws on a range of capabilities that no single fungal partner could provide alone. And a single fungal network does not serve just one tree. One network can spread across a wide area of forest floor, connecting hundreds of individual trees, trees of different ages, different species, different positions in the canopy. The network does not belong to any one of them. It runs beneath all of them, linking them in ways that are invisible from above. In the oldest forests, the fungal network beneath the soil may be older than the trees standing above it. The trees have grown and died and been replaced, generation after generation, while the network persisted, threading through the soil, outlasting the individual lives of the organisms it connected. There is something in that worth holding quietly. The trees you see in an old forest are not the forest's oldest living things. The oldest living things may be beneath your feet, in the dark, in the form of threads too fine to see. Now, carbon. When a tree fixes carbon through photosynthesis, when it pulls carbon dioxide from the air and builds it into sugar, some of that carbon begins to move, down through the tree, out through the roots, into the fungal network, and from there, it can travel. Carbon fixed by one tree can appear in a neighboring tree within days, not weeks, days, moving through the fungal threads, crossing the invisible boundary between one root system and another, arriving in a tree that may be meters away, that may never have touched the first tree's roots directly. This is not a theory. It has been measured. Researchers have used radioactive carbon tracers, carbon atoms with a distinctive signature that can be tracked through living tissue, to follow the path of carbon through forest networks in controlled experiments. They watched the labeled carbon leave one tree, enter the fungal network, and arrive in another. The transfer is real. The pathway is real. And the flow is not constant or uniform. It shifts. The direction and volume of carbon moving through the network changes with the seasons. It changes with the light. It changes with the needs of individual trees at any given moment. The network is not a static pipe. It is something more like a living system of currents, always adjusting. One of the clearest examples of this adjustment involves seedlings. On the forest floor, beneath the canopy of large trees, light is scarce. A seedling growing in deep shade cannot photosynthesize enough to sustain itself. It is making less sugar than it needs. And yet, in a healthy forest, many of these seedlings survive. They survive, in part, because the network finds them. Shaded seedlings receive more carbon from the fungal network than seedlings growing in open light. The flow tilts toward the ones that need it most. A seedling in the dark, connected to the network, is drawing on the photosynthesis of trees it has never touched. trees whose canopies are far above, gathering light the seedling cannot reach. The carbon travels down through those tall trees into the network and arrives at the roots of a seedling that would otherwise be starving. This is not charity in any sense we can assign intention to. It is chemistry. It is the movement of molecules along gradients of concentration and need. But the outcome, a small tree surviving in the dark because a larger tree's carbon found its way to it, is real, and it is measurable, and it has been observed in forests across the world. The network does not know what it is doing, and yet what it does sustains life that would not otherwise persist. Rest with that for a moment. The forest floor above you, if you were lying in a forest, would be quiet. Leaf litter, damp soil, the occasional sound of something small moving through the undergrowth. Nothing to suggest that beneath that stillness, carbon is traveling. Signals are moving. A seedling somewhere in the dark is receiving, through threads finer than hair, the sugar that will carry it through another season. The forest, from above, is many separate lives. From below, it is something that shares, and that sharing has a shape. It is not random. It is not equal in all directions, flowing outward like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. The network has structure. It has centers. And those centers are the oldest trees. In any healthy forest, there are trees that have been standing long enough to build connections that younger trees have not yet had time to form. Their roots reach deeper. Their fungal partnerships are older, more numerous, more intricate. They are woven into the network at more points, connected to more neighbors, linked to more species of fungi than the trees that grew up in their shade. These are sometimes called mother trees. The term was developed largely through the work of a forest ecologist named Suzanne Simard, who spent decades studying the forests of British Columbia. What she found, slowly and carefully, through years of field experiments and radioactive carbon tracers and patient observation, was that the oldest trees in a forest are not simply the largest members of a community. They are its anchors, its hubs, the points through which the most connections pass. A single mother tree can be linked, through the fungal network, to hundreds of other trees, not dozens, hundreds. Each of those connections is a thread along which carbon and minerals and chemical signals can travel. The mother tree sits at the center of that web, not because it chose to, not because it is aware of its position, but because it has had the most time. Time to grow, time to form partnerships, time to become, simply by persisting, the most connected thing in the forest. And the flow through those connections is not uniform. Mother trees send disproportionately large amounts of carbon and nutrients toward the seedlings growing in their vicinity. The youngest, smallest, most vulnerable members of the forest receive more from the network than their size or their contribution would seem to warrant. A seedling that has barely begun to photosynthesize, that is producing almost no sugar of its own, can still receive a steady supply of carbon through the fungal threads connecting it to a mother tree many meters away. Without that supply, many of those seedlings would not survive. Studies in British Columbia found that forests with intact mother trees had significantly higher seedling survival rates than forests where those trees had been removed. The difference was not small. The seedlings in the understory, in the deep shade where light is scarce and photosynthesis alone is not enough, depended on the network in ways that only became visible when the network was disrupted. The term hub tree is also used, and it captures something the word mother does not quite reach. A hub is a structural thing, a point of convergence. Remove it, and the connections it held do not simply redistribute themselves cleanly. They break. The trees that were linked through that hub lose their pathways to each other. The network does not reroute the way a digital system might. It frays. Removing a hub tree does not simply remove one tree from a forest. It removes the connections of every tree that passed through it. Dozens of relationships, some of them decades old, severed at once. The forest above ground may look almost unchanged. One large tree is gone. The canopy closes slowly over the gap. But below ground, the disruption is wider and quieter and longer lasting than anything visible from above. This is one reason why the oldest trees in a forest carry a weight that their size alone does not explain. And then there's something else, something that took researchers longer to find, and that still carries some uncertainty around its edges, as careful science should. Mother trees appear to recognize their own offspring. In controlled experiments using Douglas fir seedlings, researchers found that mother trees directed measurably more carbon towards seedlings grown from their own seeds than toward genetically unrelated seedlings of the same species. The seedlings looked the same. They were the same species. They were growing in the same conditions. And yet the flow of carbon through the network was different. More went to kin. The mechanism, as far as researchers can tell, involves chemical signals exchanged through root exudates, the compounds that roots release into the surrounding soil. Trees appear to be able to distinguish, through chemistry, between a seedling that carries their own genetic material and one that does not. The signal is subtle. The preference is not absolute. Mother trees still support unrelated neighbors, still contribute to the broader network. But the difference in flow is measurable. It has been observed. It has been replicated. What to make of that is a question worth holding gently. It does not require the word intention. It does not require anything like awareness or choice. The chemistry that produces this outcome may be entirely mechanical, a gradient, a signal, a response, no different in kind from the way water flows downhill. And yet the outcome is that a tree's own seedlings, growing in the dark beneath it, receive more of what they need to survive. The forest, seen this way, is not simply a collection of individuals competing for the same light and water and soil. It is something more layered than that. Something in which the oldest members are also, in some measurable sense, the most giving, in which the most connected are also the most protective of what came from them. There is a long tradition, in many cultures, of understanding forests this way, as communities rather than collections, as systems of relationship rather than assemblies of separate lives. Western science arrived at this understanding slowly, through instruments and tracers and controlled experiments. Other ways of knowing arrived there differently, and earlier. Suzanne Simard has written about the resonance between her findings and the ecological knowledge of indigenous peoples in British Columbia, who had long understood the forest as a living community, interconnected in ways that the language of individual competition could not fully describe. Science is careful about what it claims. It measures what it can measure and holds the rest as open questions. What it has measured, in these forests, is real enough. Carbon flowing from old trees to young ones, seedlings surviving in darkness they could not endure alone, a network that responds when its center is removed, a preference, quiet and chemical, for one's own. These are not metaphors. They are observations. They are the results of experiments conducted in real forests, with real trees, over real decades of patient work. And they suggest that the forest floor beneath which all of this moves, that quiet layer of damp soil and leaf litter and fungal thread, is not a passive foundation. It is the place where the forest's oldest relationships live, where the connections that hold the whole structure together are maintained, slowly, in the dark, by organisms that have been doing this work for longer than most of what we would recognize as life on land. The mother tree above you, if you were standing in an old forest, would give no sign of what it was doing below. Its bark would be still. Its canopy would move only with the wind. Nothing visible would suggest that through its roots, at this moment, carbon was traveling outward, that somewhere in the soil nearby, a seedling was receiving. But it would be happening. It has been happening, in forests like that one, for hundreds of millions of years. And somewhere, in a forest that is old enough, it is happening now. Let that settle. The oldest trees, quietly at the center of everything. The youngest, quietly receiving. And between them, in the dark, the threads that connect one life to another without either of them knowing. And yet the preference is not absolute. A mother tree does not give only to her own. The flow toward kin is stronger, measurably so, but the network does not close itself off to strangers. Unrelated seedlings Trees of different species, neighbors with no shared lineage, they receive too. The carbon still moves toward them. The minerals still arrive. The connection is simply quieter, a little less generous, perhaps, but present. This is worth holding gently for a moment. For a long time, the prevailing understanding of plants was that they were passive, rooted in place, yes, but also indifferent, responding to light and water and gravity, but not to each other, not in any way that resembled awareness or preference or recognition. The evidence gathered over the past few decades has made that picture harder to hold. A tree that sends more carbon to its own seedlings than to unrelated ones is, in some measurable sense, distinguishing between them. It is behaving differently depending on who is nearby. That is not the behavior of something entirely indifferent to its surroundings. Some researchers are careful here, and that carefulness is worth respecting. The word communication carries weight. It implies, to many ears, something like intention. A sender who means to send. A receiver who is meant to receive. And whether trees have anything resembling intention, whether there is any form of experience behind these exchanges, is a question that science cannot yet answer and may never be able to answer cleanly. What can be measured is the transfer itself. Chemical signals moving through soil, resources flowing along fungal threads, one tree's chemistry changing in response to another tree's chemistry. These are real, documented, repeatable observations. The interpretation layered on top of them, whether to call it communication or warning or care, that is a separate question. A human question, perhaps more than a forest one. So let the facts rest as facts, for now, and the facts are already remarkable enough. Trees release chemical compounds into the air when they are stressed or damaged. These are volatile organic compounds, molecules light enough to drift, to disperse, to reach the leaves of a neighboring tree without any underground connection at all. A tree being eaten by insects will begin releasing these compounds within hours. A tree standing nearby with no fungal thread between them, no root contact, nothing but air. That neighboring tree can receive the signal and begin to respond. It begins producing tannins. Tannins are bitter, difficult to digest. They make leaves less appealing, less nourishing to the insects that would eat them. A tree that begins producing tannins before any insect has touched it is, in effect, preparing for something it has not yet experienced. It is responding to a neighbor's distress, as though that distress were a forecast. This has been observed in willow trees, in alder, in poplar. The airborne signal travels quickly as wind allows, but it is also, in some ways, a blunt instrument, a general alarm rather than a detailed message. The air carries urgency, but not much nuance. The underground signals are different. When a tree is under attack and its roots are in contact with a fungal network, it can release chemical compounds directly into the soil. Those compounds travel along the fungal threads, slowly, over hours or days, not seconds, and arrive at the roots of connected neighbors. The signal that arrives underground can carry more specific information than the one that drifts through the air. More detail about the nature of the threat, more precision in the response it triggers. The neighboring tree, receiving this slower, more specific signal, begins its own preparations. Tannins again, perhaps, or other defensive compounds, depending on the species and the threat. The response is not identical in every tree, it is proportional. A stronger signal produces a stronger response. A faint signal, arriving from a distant part of the network, produces a subtler shift. The tree is not simply switching on or off, it is calibrating. There is something in that calibration that is difficult to dismiss as purely mechanical, and yet the careful scientist will note that mechanical systems can be exquisitely sensitive without being aware. A thermostat calibrates. A river calibrates, in its way, to the slope of the land. Calibration alone does not require experience. And still, the image of a forest preparing itself, quietly, underground, in the hours before an insect swarm arrives, is one that does not easily leave the mind. Drought sends its own signals through the network. A tree underwater stress releases chemical compounds that travel to its connected neighbors, and those neighbors, in some documented cases, begin to alter their own behavior. They reduce water loss through their leaves. They adjust the opening and closing of the tiny pores, the stomata, through which they breathe and through which water escapes. They become, in a measurable sense, more conservative with water. Not because they are dry, because a neighbor is. The network, in this way, may help a forest survive conditions that would overwhelm individual trees acting alone. A drought that strikes one part of a forest sends its signal outward through the fungal threads, and the trees that receive it begin preparing before the drought reaches them. The whole system becomes slightly more resilient than the sum of its parts. This is not cooperation in the way we usually mean the word, not chosen, not conscious, not generous in any sense we can verify. But the outcome of it is something that functions like cooperation, something that looks, from a distance, like a community responding to shared difficulty. And the forest has been doing this for a very long time. Long before there were words for tannins or stomata or volatile, organic compounds. Long before anyone was watching. The signals were moving then as they move now, through air and soil and fungal thread, carrying information that trees cannot read in any way we understand, and yet, somehow, acting on. Let that be enough for now. The forest outside, wherever it is, if there is one near enough to imagine, is not still in the way a room is still. Its stillness is a surface. Beneath it, and within it, chemistry is moving, signals are traveling. Some tree, somewhere in that quiet dark, is receiving something it did not know it needed, and responding without urgency, without sound, in the slow, patient way that forests have always done their most important work. Not in the canopy, where the light is, but below, where no one is watching. Where the threads run between one root and another, and the forest holds itself together. There is something else the network carries, beyond carbon and phosphorus and the slow warnings of insects. It carries water. Not water itself, exactly, but the knowledge of water, the signal of its absence. When a tree begins to feel the pressure of drought, when its cells sense that the soil around its roots is drying, it releases compounds into that soil. Those compounds enter the fungal threads, and somewhere along the network, a neighboring tree receives them. What happens next is quiet and careful and worth holding in mind as you rest. The neighboring tree reduces its own water use, not because anything commanded it to, not because it calculated a benefit, but because the chemistry arrived, and the chemistry changed something, and the tree responded in the only way trees respond, slowly, without drama, by adjusting. This coordinated drawing down of water use across connected trees may help the network as a whole move through drought. A forest that shares the signal of scarcity may lose fewer trees than one where each tree faces that scarcity alone. The research is still careful about how far to take this, but the pattern is there, measurable, repeated across different species and different soils. The network is not only generous in abundance, it is also, in its way, careful in difficulty. And then there is nitrogen. Nitrogen is everywhere in the air above a forest. It makes up most of that air, in fact. But nitrogen in the air is not nitrogen a tree can use. Trees need nitrogen in the soil in forms their roots can absorb. And in many forests, that kind of nitrogen is scarce. In boreal forests especially, those vast, cold stretches of spruce and pine and fir that cover so much of the northern world, the soil is often poor in nitrogen. The growing season is short. The cold slows decomposition. What little nitrogen exists must be found and delivered with care. This is where the fungal network becomes something close to essential. The threads reach into soil pores too small for roots. They find nitrogen in forms the tree alone could not access. They carry it back, and the tree, in exchange, sends sugar, the same quiet transaction that has been running for hundreds of millions of years, in soils that look nothing like these soils. between organisms that look nothing like these trees. Phosphorus moves through the network too. This has been measured carefully in dozens of field studies across many forest types and many continents. Researchers have traced it with chemical markers, watched it move from fungal thread to root cell, confirmed what the trees and fungi have known in their chemical way for far longer than science has existed. Phosphorus is essential for growth, for the transfer of energy within cells, for the building of roots and leaves and seeds. A tree without access to phosphorus struggles. A tree connected to a healthy fungal network rarely lacks it. These three things, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, move through the same threads in different directions at different times according to different needs. The network is not a single pipe carrying a single substance. It is something more like a slow, living circulation, carrying what is needed to where it is needed, adjusting as conditions change. And the network does not only serve the living. When a tree dies, when its last leaves fall and its roots go still and the chemistry of its life begins to slow, it does not immediately leave the network. For some time after death, the fungal threads remain, the connections persist, and through those connections, the dying tree continues to release what it held. Carbon, minerals, the slow residue of a life spent photosynthesizing. A fallen log is not an ending, it is a different kind of beginning. As fungi colonize the wood, breaking down the cellulose, the lignin, the dense architecture of what was once a living trunk, they release nutrients back into the soil, slowly, over years, over decades. The log becomes a source, feeding the network that surrounds it, which feeds the trees that shade it, which will one day fall and become logs themselves. These fallen trees are sometimes called nurse logs. The name is gentle and accurate. Seedlings take root on their surfaces, drawing on the nutrients the decomposing wood releases. The soft, broken down wood holds moisture. It provides a raised surface above the competition of the forest floor, and through the fungal network that runs through it, the nurse log connects those seedlings to the wider community of the forest. A tree that fell a century ago may still be feeding the seedlings growing from its remains. The line between one generation and the next is not a line at all. It is a continuation, mediated by fungi, running through wood and soil and root. The forest floor, then, is not simply the ground beneath the trees. It is not a passive surface, a substrate, a place where things fall and stop. It is alive in ways that are easy to overlook when you're looking up at the canopy, at the light moving through leaves, at the visible, breathing world above. Below that world, the floor is exchanging, transforming, breaking things down and building things up, cycling carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus through organisms so small they are invisible, through threads so fine they pass through the spaces between grains of soil. The fungi in that floor, taken together across a healthy forest, represent a significant portion of all the living matter in the ecosystem. Not a footnote, not a background detail, a major fraction of the forest's total biomass, present in every handful of soil, running beneath every root, connecting what is living to what is dying to what has not yet begun to grow. In some forests, the combined mass of the fungi in the soil exceeds the combined mass of every animal living in the same area. Every deer, every bird, every insect, every worm, outweighed by the quiet, invisible body of the fungal network beneath them. This is not a fact that announces itself. It does not ask for attention. It simply is, has been, for a very long time, present beneath the surface of every old forest, doing its work without sound or light or any of the signals that living things usually use to make themselves known. There is something settling about that. Something that asks nothing of you except, perhaps, a quiet acknowledgement that the world is larger and older and more intricately woven than it appears from any single vantage point. You are lying still now. Your own body is doing its quiet work, breathing, cycling, maintaining the slow chemistry of rest. Not so different, in its way, from the chemistry moving through the soil of a forest somewhere in the dark. The threads are running. The nutrients are moving. Some seedling, somewhere, is receiving what it needs from a tree that fell before it was born. And the forest holds. And beneath all of that holding, there is variety. Not just one kind of fungus threading through the dark, but hundreds in a single old-growth forest. The number of distinct mycorrhizal fungal species living in the soil often exceeds the number of tree species growing above it. The canopy you might see from a hillside, the oaks, the firs, the birches, the beeches, is only part of the story. Below, the diversity runs deeper still. Each species doing something slightly different. Some fungal partners are particularly skilled at reaching phosphorus, the mineral locked in tiny pockets of soil that roots alone could never find. Others are better suited to gathering nitrogen, pulling it from the slow chemistry of decomposing matter and carrying it toward the roots that need it. Some extend their threads into drier layers of soil, reaching moisture that shallower networks cannot touch. Others specialize in the chemistry of coal, or of shade, or of the particular mineral composition of a certain hillside. A tree connected to many of these partners at once is a tree with many kinds of reach. It can draw on phosphorus from one direction, nitrogen from another, water from a third. If one fungal partner struggles, perhaps the soil in one area becomes too dry or too disturbed. The tree still has others. The network around it is not a single thread, but a web of webs, layered and redundant, each strand offering something slightly different. This is what resilience looks like. Underground, not strength in the sense of hardness or resistance, but depth. The depth of many connections, many partnerships, many quiet arrangements made over centuries between roots and threads in the dark. And then the trees are cut. Not all at once, perhaps. A section of forest cleared for timber or for land. The trees come down. The stumps remain for a while, and then they too are removed or left to rot. New seedlings are planted, sometimes the same species, sometimes different ones, arranged in rows for easier harvest. The forest, from above, begins again. But below the surface, something is missing. Fungal diversity in the soil tends to decline after logging, even when the trees are replanted promptly. The physical disturbance of harvest, the machinery moving across the ground, the roots torn up, the soil turned and compressed, disrupts the mycelial threads that took decades or centuries to establish. Many fungal species disappear. Not all of them return. What grows back is often simpler. A replanted forest, even a carefully managed one, often carries only a fraction of the fungal diversity that existed in the old growth it replaced. A few resilient species persist or recolonize quickly, but the hundreds of distinct partnerships that characterize the original forest, the layered specializations, the redundant connections, the deep networks reaching into old soil, those take far longer to rebuild. Decades, in many cases, sometimes longer. The trees above ground may look healthy after 20 or 30 years. They may be growing, producing wood, cycling water through their leaves in the familiar way of forests, but the network beneath them is still recovering, still thin in places where it was once dense, still missing partners that have not yet returned, or may not return at all. And a forest with a depleted fungal network is a quieter forest in ways that matter. Less able to move nutrients to seedlings and shade, less able to buffer the effects of drought, less able to warn its members of approaching stress. The trees are present, but some of the conversation between them has gone quiet. Some restoration ecologists have begun to work with this knowledge directly. Rather than planting seedlings into bare, disturbed soil and hoping the fungal community rebuilds on its own, some projects now inoculate the seedlings before they go into the ground. The roots of young trees are introduced to mycorrhizal fungi in controlled conditions, a deliberate seeding of the partnership that would otherwise have to form slowly, by chance, in degraded soil. The results are measurable. Inoculated seedlings tend to survive at higher rates. They grow more quickly in soils that would otherwise limit them. They establish connections sooner, and those early connections give them access to resources that uninoculated seedlings must wait years to reach. It is a small intervention. In some ways, a handful of fungal spores introduced to a root system before planting, but its effects ripple outward through the life of the tree. The health of the fungal network, it turns out, is a better predictor of long-term forest health than the number of trees planted. A dense planting of seedlings in fungally depleted soil may produce a forest that looks full but functions poorly. A sparser planting in soil with a recovering fungal community may produce a forest that is quieter to the eye but richer in its inner workings. The trees are the visible part. The network is the part that determines what they can become. There are other pressures, too, that the network carries quietly. Heavy machinery moving through a forest compacts the soil. The tiny pore spaces that fungal threads navigate, the gaps between soil particles where mycelium spreads and water moves, are crushed under the weight of equipment. Compacted soil is harder for fungal threads to penetrate. The network, where compaction is severe, may take decades to recover its former density and reach. And the chemistry of the soil can shift in ways that are harder to see. Pesticides and fungicides applied to forest soils, sometimes to protect seedlings from pathogens, sometimes drifting from nearby agricultural land, can damage mycorrhizal communities even at concentrations too low to cause obvious harm. The fungi are sensitive. What seems like a small chemical presence to a larger organism can be enough to reduce the diversity of species that survive in a given patch of soil. Even the air carries its effects downward. Excess nitrogen, deposited from the atmosphere as a byproduct of combustion in agriculture, settles into forest soils over time. Nitrogen is a nutrient, and in small amounts it is welcome. But in excess, it shifts the balance of the fungal community. A few species that thrive in nitrogen-rich conditions begin to dominate. The others, the specialists, the rarer partners with their particular skills and reaches, become less common. The network simplifies. And a simplified network is a more fragile one. This is the quiet arithmetic of the forest floor. Diversity is not decoration. It is function. Each additional fungal species in the soil is another kind of reach, another kind of resilience, another thread in the web that holds the trees through drought and cold and the slow pressures of a changing world. The old forests understood this, and the only way forests understand anything, by surviving. Centuries of disturbance, of fire and storm, and the slow cycling of individual trees through death and renewal, and the fungal networks beneath them persisted, adapted, held their diversity through the long patience of deep time. What they were not shaped for is the speed of what comes now, the pace of clearing, the chemistry drifting down from the sky, the weight of machines moving across ground that has not been compacted in 10,000 years. These are new pressures, arriving faster than the slow processes of fungal recovery can answer. And so the forests that remain, the old ones, the ones with their full depth of fungal diversity still intact, hold something that cannot be quickly replaced. Not just the trees, not just the carbon stored in wood and soil, but the accumulated partnerships, the hundreds of quiet arrangements between root and thread, the layered resilience of a network that has been building itself, species by species, connection by connection, for longer than any individual tree has been alive. You are resting now. The world above the soil is still. And somewhere, in a forest that has never been cleared, the threads are running through the dark, each one a different species, each one carrying something slightly different toward the roots that are waiting. The network holds its diversity like a forest holds its silence. Not empty, full. And the warmth of that fullness carries its own kind of weight. Because the network is not only holding what it has, it is also being asked to move. Climate is shifting. The bands of temperature that different tree species have lived within for thousands of years are drifting northward and upward toward higher ground. Trees respond to this slowly. The way trees respond to everything, through seeds, through the patient accumulation of generations. A forest does not walk. It migrates in the only way it can, one seed at a time, one new seedling taking root a little further from where its parents stood. But the fungi beneath the soil are also living things, with their own ranges, their own tolerances for temperature and moisture and soil chemistry. And they do not always move at the same pace. Some mycorrhizal fungi are shifting their ranges in response to warming, but the direction and speed of that shift does not always match the direction and speed of the trees above them. A tree species moving toward cooler ground may arrive somewhere its fungal partners have not yet reached. The soil there may be unfamiliar. The partnerships that sustained it for centuries may not be waiting. This mismatch, tree arriving, fungus absent, is something forest ecologists are watching carefully. It is not yet fully understood, but it is a quiet concern, growing alongside the warming itself. A seedling can survive without its full complement of fungal partners for a time, but the resilience that comes from deep, diverse fungal connection takes decades to build. A tree that arrives somewhere new without its network is more exposed, more alone in the soil than it would otherwise be. And so the old forests, the ones that have not moved, the ones that have been building their networks in the same ground for centuries, hold something that cannot be easily reconstructed elsewhere. They hold depth. Old-growth forests store more carbon than young forests. This is known. But the reason is not only the size of the trees, the mass of wood accumulated over centuries. Part of the reason is what lies beneath. The fungal networks of old-growth forests are deeper, more complex, more diverse than those of young forests or plantations. They have had more time. More species have found their way into the web. More connections have formed and strengthened and ramified through the soil. That carbon, held in fungal threads, in the organic matter they have helped build, in the slow chemistry of old soil, is part of what makes an old forest what it is. Protecting an old-growth forest is therefore also protecting what cannot be seen from above, the underground carbon storage, the accumulated depth of a network that has been building itself since before any of the current trees were born. When that forest is cleared, the carbon in the wood is released quickly as the timber is processed or burned. But the carbon in the fungal network does not disappear all at once. It releases more slowly, over the years that follow, as the threads die back and the organic matter they held begins to break down without the living network to maintain it. This slower release is often not counted in the standard estimates of what deforestation costs the atmosphere. The accounting tends to focus on the trees. The fungal carbon beneath them is harder to measure, harder to see, and so it is often left out of the numbers. But it is there, and it matters. And so the full cost of clearing an old forest is larger than what is usually reported. Some of it is paid over years, quietly, in the continued release of carbon from soil that is no longer held together by living threads. There is something else worth saying here, gently, before moving on. The way the network has been described in popular accounts as a kind of forest internet, a system of mutual aid, trees sharing resources and something like generosity. This picture is not wrong, exactly, but it is incomplete. Some researchers have pushed back, carefully, on the more romantic versions of the story. The network is not uniformly cooperative. Competition runs through it alongside cooperation. Some fungi behave more like parasites than partners, taking sugars from tree roots without delivering equivalent minerals in return. The relationship exists on a spectrum, and not every point on that spectrum is mutual benefit. Some trees, too, can draw resources from the network without contributing their share. A tree under stress, or a young tree not yet producing much sugar, may take more than it gives for a time. The network tolerates this, to a degree, but the balance is not always equal, and it is not always fair. And then there are the plants that have taken this further still. The ghost orchid has no chlorophyll. It cannot photosynthesize. It produces no sugar of its own, contributes nothing to the network and the currency the network runs on. And yet, it lives. It survives entirely by drawing carbon through the fungal threads around it. taking what other plants have made and passed into the web. These plants, the ghost orchid and others like it, are called mycorrhizal. They are entirely dependent on the network. Without it, they cannot exist. They are, in a sense, the network's passengers or its quiet thieves, depending on how one chooses to see it. The existence of these cheaters does not undo the cooperative elements of the network. Both things are true at once: cooperation and exploitation, running through the same threads in the same soil at the same time. The network is not a simple story. It is better understood as what it actually is: a complex web of relationships, some mutualistic, some parasitic, some shifting between the two depending on conditions and season and the particular needs of the organisms involved. The word cooperation is not wrong, but it is not the whole picture. Scientists tend to prefer the term mycorrhizal network over Wood Wide Web, partly for this reason. The popular metaphor is useful for opening a door, but the room behind the door is more complicated than the metaphor suggests. And that complexity is not a disappointment. It is, if anything, more honest, more like the world as it actually is, full of arrangements that do not resolve neatly into heroes and villains, givers and takers, full of relationships that are partly one thing and partly another, depending on the moment and the need. The forest holds all of this at once. The mother tree sending carbon toward her seedlings, the fungus withholding phosphorus from a tree that has not given enough, the ghost orchid, pale and rootless, drawing its life from threads it will never repay. All of it happening in the dark. All of it happening now in forests that are resting under their own quiet weight, while the night moves slowly overhead. You are resting too. The complexity of the network does not ask anything of you. It simply continues, as it has continued for hundreds of millions of years, through conditions far more difficult than this moment. Let the threads run through the dark. Let the exchanges happen without your attention. The forest does not need to be understood to be held together, and neither do you. There is a word scientists prefer: mycorrhizal network. Not Wood Wide Web, though that phrase has its own quiet poetry. The more precise term carries less metaphor and more accuracy. And accuracy, in the end, is a kind of respect for the thing being described. The internet comparison is useful up to a point. It helps the mind find a shape for something invisible. But the forest network has no central server, no routing protocol, no signal traveling at the speed of light through fiber and glass. What moves through the fungal threads moves slowly, through chemistry and physics, through concentration gradients and molecular diffusion, through the patient logic of living tissue responding to what it senses around it. There is no intention in any of this. No tree decides to send carbon. No fungus chooses to withhold phosphorus. What happens because of chemistry, because of the way molecules behave when they meet certain conditions, certain needs, certain concentrations of sugar or mineral or stress compound. And yet, the outcomes are real. A seedling that would have died in the shade is still alive. A neighboring tree has begun producing tannins before any insect has touched its bark. Carbon fixed in one crown on a bright afternoon has arrived. Days later, in the roots of a tree that needed it. These are not metaphors. They are measurements. Numbers recorded in notebooks, confirmed by tracers, replicated in different forests on different continents. The chemistry does not intend anything, but the forest, as a result of that chemistry, behaves in ways that look, from a certain distance, like care. That distance is worth keeping in mind. The appearance of care and the presence of care are not the same thing. Science holds that distinction carefully, and the distinction is worth holding. What remains after the careful language is still something, a network, ancient and functional, moving resources toward need, responding to damage, persisting through seasons and centuries without any center, without any mind, without anything that resembles a plan. The Douglas fir knows this network as well as any tree on Earth. In the forests of the Pacific Northwest, where the winters are long and the canopy is deep, the Douglas fir has been studied more closely than almost any other tree in mycorrhizal research. Its roots, its fungal partners, its seedlings, its mother trees, all of it mapped and measured and followed across years and decades. A single Douglas fir mother tree, old and wide and deeply rooted, can be connected to as many as 47 other trees through one fungal network. 47 separate root systems, each touching the same threads, each part of the same slow exchange. The mother tree at the center of that network is not aware of the 47. She does not count them or tend them in any conscious way, but the carbon she fixes, the signals she releases, the fungal partners she has cultivated over decades, all of it radiates outward, through the soil to trees she will never touch directly. Some of those trees are her own seedlings, and the flow toward them is measurably greater. Not because she knows them in any way we would recognize as knowing, but because the chemistry of kinship, the shared compounds in root exudates, the familiar molecular signatures of her own genetic line, creates a gradient that the network follows. The carbon moves toward what is most similar. It is not love, but it is not nothing. Farther north, in the mixed forests where birch and fir grow side by side, something else has been observed. Something that took researchers a long time to believe and longer still to explain. In summer, when the fir trees are in full photosynthesis and the birch canopy is dense with leaves, carbon flows from the fir toward the birch. The fir, with its year-round needles and its deep fungal connections, produces more than it needs in those months, and the excess moves through the shared network toward its deciduous neighbor. Then winter comes. The birch loses its leaves. The fir keeps its needles, keeps photosynthesizing through the cold at a slower pace, and the direction of flow reverses. Carbon that spent the summer moving from fir to birch now moves from birch to fir. A seasonal reciprocity, each tree giving when it has more, receiving when it has less, not because either tree has calculated anything, but because the network responds to gradients, and the gradients shift with the light and the season. This was one of the first times scientists confirmed that carbon could flow in both directions through a natural forest network, not just from large to small, not just from old to young, but back and forth, across time, as conditions changed. It suggested something about mixed forests that foresters had long suspected but not been able to measure. That a forest with many different species, many different canopy structures, many different seasonal rhythms, might be more stable over time than a forest of a single species, because the diversity of timing creates a diversity of surplus and need, and the network, responding to that diversity, keeps more of the carbon in circulation, keeps more of the trees fed, keeps more of the system intact through the difficult seasons. A monoculture has a single rhythm. When conditions are hard for one tree, they are hard for all of them at once. There is no neighbor with a different schedule, no partner whose surplus arrives at exactly the moment of greatest need. The mixed forest holds more possibilities, more ways to balance. In the beech forests of Europe, the network works in a different register, but toward the same quiet end. Beech trees cast a deep shade. Their canopy is dense enough that the forest floor beneath them receives very little direct light. A beech seedling germinating in that understory faces conditions that would seem, by any simple calculation, to be impossible. And yet beech seedlings survive there, slowly, patiently, in the near dark, drawing on carbon that arrives not from the sun above them, but from the soil below. The fungal network connects them to the larger trees overhead. The mother beeches, their roots spreading wide through the same threads, allow carbon to flow downward into the seedlings that their own canopy is shading. It is a quiet paradox. The tree that blocks the light also provides the alternative. The seedling waits in the dark, and the dark is not empty. In the tropical forests, the story is less complete. The arbuscular mycorrhizal networks that thread through those soils are older. In evolutionary terms, than the ectomycorrhizal networks of the temperate north, but they are harder to study. The soils are different. The species are more numerous, the conditions more variable. What is believed, carefully, is that the networks there are equally important, perhaps more so. Tropical soils are often poor in nutrients despite the abundance of life above them. The forest holds its nutrients not in the ground, but in the living tissue of the trees themselves, cycling them rapidly through roots and fungi and decomposers before the heavy rains can wash them away. The fungal network in a tropical forest is part of that rapid cycling, part of what keeps the nutrients in the system rather than lost to the rivers. How exactly it works, in all its detail, is still being learned. The forest is patient with that uncertainty. It has been doing this longer than anyone has been watching. Somewhere beneath you now, if there is soil nearby, if there are roots and threads and the slow chemistry of living ground, something like this is happening. Not loudly, not urgently. Just the quiet movement of molecules through dark soil, the patient arithmetic of need and surplus, the network, neither kind nor unkind, simply continuing as it has continued, for longer than there have been words for any of it. The Amazon is a particular kind of abundance, a forest so dense, so layered with life, that it can seem as though the soil beneath it must be equally rich, but it is not. The soil of the Amazon basin is, in many places, surprisingly thin in nutrients. The richness of that forest is not stored in the ground, it is stored in the living tissue of the trees, the leaves, the roots, the fungi, and it moves, constantly, rapidly, cycling through organisms before the rain can carry it away. The rainfall in the Amazon is heavy and persistent. Water that falls on the canopy reaches the ground and continues downward. And if nutrients were simply lying loose in the soil, they would follow that water into the rivers and be gone. The forest has, over millions of years, developed ways of catching them before they leave. The fungal network is one of those ways. Mycorrhizal threads intercept nutrients as they move through the soil. They pass them upward into roots, into trunks, into leaves that will eventually fall and decompose and be intercepted again. The cycle is tight. Almost nothing escapes. The forest retains what it needs by moving it continuously through living tissue, rather than leaving it to the mercy of the rain. When that network is broken, when the trees are removed and the soil is exposed, the cycle stops. The nutrients that were held in living tissue are released all at once, and the rain takes them. The soil, already thin, becomes thinner, and the network that would have helped new trees establish themselves is gone. This is part of why reforestation in cleared Amazon land is so difficult. It is not only that the trees are absent, it is that the underground architecture that supported them is absent too. Replanting trees into soil stripped of its fungal community is a slower, harder process than it might appear from above. The trees go in, but the network is not there to receive them. That network, once disrupted, does not return quickly. It returns in fragments, over years, over decades, if the conditions allow, and in the meantime, the soil continues to lose what little it holds. Far to the north, a different kind of forest faces a different kind of constraint. In the boreal, the growing season is short. The window between the last frost and the first is measured in weeks rather than months. Trees in these forests must do in a brief, warm season what trees in temperate climates spread across many months. Every week of warmth is a week of work. Every nutrient that can be absorbed must be absorbed quickly. The fungal network in a boreal forest is tuned to that urgency. When the soil warms and the season opens, the network activates. Nutrients that have been locked in cold soil begin to move. The fungal threads, already in place, already connected, begin delivering phosphorus and nitrogen to roots that are ready to receive them. The trees do not have to wait for their roots to find new soil. The network is already there, already reaching. Without that network, the short season would be even shorter in its usefulness. The trees would spend precious weeks establishing connections that the fungal network provides from the first day of warmth. But the boreal is changing. Permafrost, the layer of permanently frozen ground beneath much of the boreal forest, is thawing in many regions. As it thaws, it releases water and changes the chemistry of the soil above it. Soils that were cold and stable become waterlogged, acidic, altered in ways that not all fungal communities can tolerate. Some mycorrhizal species decline, others shift their ranges. The network that a tree has relied on for decades may no longer be the same network it wakes to in spring. What this means for the long-term health of boreal forests is still being understood. The changes are happening faster than the science can fully follow. What is known is that the soil is not a fixed thing. It is a living system, and living systems respond to change, not always in ways that are easy to predict. There is another role the fungal network plays that is quieter still, and perhaps less often considered. The network protects. Some mycorrhizal fungi produce compounds that function like antibiotics. They suppress the growth of harmful microbes in the soil around tree roots. Pathogens that would otherwise colonize a root tip and cause disease are held back by the chemical environment the fungi create. A tree surrounded by a healthy fungal community is, in a sense, surrounded by a kind of living shield. Trees in degraded soils, soils where the fungal community has been reduced by compaction, or pollution, or repeated disturbance, are more vulnerable. Root rot becomes more common. Infections that a healthy network might have suppressed find easier entry. The tree is not only less nourished without its fungal partners, it is less defended. This protective function extends even into contaminated ground. In soils polluted with heavy metals, lead, cadmium, and others, some mycorrhizal fungi are able to sequester those metals within their own tissue. They absorb the contamination before it reaches the root. The tree, connected to these fungi, takes up less of what would otherwise harm it. The fungus holds the metal, and the root is spared. This is not a perfect protection. It has limits, and those limits depend on the concentration of the contaminant and the species of fungus involved. But it is real and measurable, and it has led some researchers to consider whether mycorrhizal fungi might be deliberately introduced into contaminated soils as part of efforts to restore damaged land. The fungus doing quietly, in the dark, what would otherwise require considerable human effort. There is something worth pausing on here before moving further. When most people think of fungi, they think of what is visible. The mushroom pushing up through leaf litter on an autumn morning, the pale cap, the gills beneath, the stem rising from the soil. It seems like the thing itself. But the mushroom is not the organism. Not really. The mushroom is a fruiting body, a temporary structure, built for reproduction, designed to release spores into the air and then dissolve back into the ground. It appears for days, sometimes only hours, and then it is gone. The organism is below. The mycelium, the vast, branching network of threads spreading through the soil, is the living body of the fungus. It may have been growing for years, for decades, for longer. It does not fruit every season. It does not need to be seen to be present. It simply continues, in the dark, doing the work it has always done. The mushroom you might find on a forest walk is a brief signal from something much older and much larger beneath your feet. A momentary emergence, a small visible gesture from a mostly invisible life. And that life, threaded through the soil, wrapped around roots, moving carbon and phosphorus and water and chemical signals through the dark, is what holds the forest together. Not the trunks, not the canopy, not the visible, upward-reaching architecture of wood and leaf. The holding happens below, in the quiet, in the slow chemistry of threads too fine to see, in the patient, ancient work of organisms that were forming partnerships with roots before there were forests to speak of. The mushroom fades, the mycelium remains. As it has remained, through seasons and centuries and the slow turning of the world above it. Still there, still working, still holding. And that network, the mycelium, the living body of the fungus, does not stay small. A single network can spread across many hectares of forest floor, threading beneath the leaf litter, beneath the roots, beneath the slow accumulation of centuries of fallen things, moving outward, year by year, in no particular hurry, connecting what it finds. The scale of this is difficult to hold in the mind, and perhaps it is better not to try too hard. Simply let it rest there. The knowledge that beneath a forest, something living extends in all directions, farther than you could walk in an afternoon. There is a fungus in the mountains of Oregon that has been growing for an estimated 2,000 years or more. Its mycelium spreads across thousands of acres of forest. It is sometimes described as one of the largest living organisms on Earth, a single organism, by some definitions, occupying a space larger than many towns. But this particular fungus, the honey fungus, as it is known, is not a mycorrhizal partner. It does not offer phosphorus in exchange for sugar. It does not hold seedlings through their first winters or carry carbon from the old to the young. It is a pathogen. It moves through the soil and into the roots of trees, and it kills them. Slowly, over years, it takes what it needs without giving anything back. This distinction matters. Not all large fungal networks are the same. Not all of them are holding the forest together. Some are taking it apart, quietly, from below. The forest contains both kinds, the partners and the pathogens, the givers and the takers, and the trees, as far as we can tell, cannot always tell the difference until the relationship is already underway. Forest managers have learned to pay attention to this. A healthy soil is not simply a soil full of fungi. It is a soil with the right fungi, in the right balance, doing the right work. That balance, once disrupted, is not easily restored. And yet, even the pathogens are part of the system. A tree killed by fungal disease becomes a fallen log, a nurse log, a slow source of carbon and minerals for the network around it. Even in dying, the tree continues to give. The forest finds a use for everything. Eventually, some fungi have found a different kind of relationship with trees, one that is neither purely cooperative nor destructive, but something more specific, more particular. The truffle grows underground, never surfacing. It forms its partnerships with oak trees, with hazel, with certain other species in certain kinds of soil. The relationship is ectomycorrhizal. The fungal threads wrap around the outside of the root tips, forming a sheath, a close and careful embrace. In exchange for the carbon the tree provides, the truffle delivers minerals from the soil, the same ancient trade, the same patient exchange. But the truffle requires very specific conditions, a particular soil chemistry, a particular tree partner, a particular depth and moisture and mineral composition that cannot simply be manufactured. This is why truffles are rare, why they are difficult to find and impossible to rush. Their scarcity is not an accident of nature. It is a direct consequence of how deeply embedded they are in a living system that cannot be replicated in a greenhouse or a laboratory. People have tried, for centuries, people have tried to grow truffles in controlled conditions, and the results are always the same. Without the tree, without the specific soil, without the network, there is no truffle. The fungus will not fruit. It has no reason to. The chanterelle is the same. That golden mushroom found in temperate forests, in the damp shade beneath old trees. It is mycorrhizal. It is connected, and it cannot be farmed. Every chanterelle you have ever seen came from a living forest, from a living network, from a relationship between fungus and root that no human hand assembled. This is true of many of the wild mushrooms that people have gathered from forests for thousands of years. They cannot be separated from the trees that sustain them. They are not products of the forest. They are expressions of it, visible moments in a relationship that runs far deeper than the surface. The forest gives these things freely when the conditions are right, when the network is intact, when the soil is undisturbed and the trees are old enough and the partnerships have had time to deepen. And perhaps this is part of why people have always felt something in old forests, something that is difficult to name. There is a practice, developed in Japan and now studied in several countries, of spending quiet time among trees, walking slowly, sitting, breathing, not hiking, not exercising, not achieving anything in particular, simply being present in the forest. It has been given a name: forest bathing. Researchers have measured what happens to the human body during this kind of time. Cortisol levels, a marker of stress, tend to fall. Heart rate slows. Something in the nervous system settles. Part of this may be the quiet, the softness of light through leaves, the absence of screens and noise and urgency, but part of it may be something more chemical. Trees release compounds into the air as part of their signaling system. Volatile organic compounds, some of which are called phytoncides. These are the same molecules that trees use to warn their neighbors of insect attack. The same chemistry that travels through the air from one crown to another, triggering defensive responses in trees that have not yet been touched. When a human being walks through a forest and breathes that air, they are breathing those compounds. And some of those compounds appear to have measurable effects on human physiology: reduced cortisol, shifts in immune markers, a quieting of the body's alarm systems. The forest is not producing these compounds for us. It is not aware of us. As far as we can tell, it is simply doing what it has always done, sending chemical messages through the air, maintaining its own conversations, managing its own relationships. We happen to be moving through a space full of signals that were never meant for us, and our bodies respond to them anyway. This is a strange and quiet thing to consider. The forest is not silent. It has never been silent. It is full of conversation, chemical, slow, continuous, most of it moving at frequencies and concentrations far below what human senses can detect. The air carries it. The soil carries it. The fungal threads carry it. We walk through it without knowing. We breathe it without understanding. And something in us, perhaps something very old, responds. Soil scientists have a word for the zone of soil immediately surrounding a root. They call it the rhizosphere. It is a narrow band, just a few millimeters thick in some places, where the root ends and the soil begins. Or rather, where the two meet and blur into each other. The rhizosphere is one of the most biologically active environments on Earth. In that thin margin, bacteria and fungi and nematodes and other organisms too small to see gather in extraordinary numbers. The root releases compounds that attract certain microbes and repel others. The microbes respond, and in responding, change the chemistry of the soil around them, which changes what the root can absorb, which changes what the root releases. It is a conversation, of a kind, happening in a space you could cover with a fingernail, happening right now, beneath every tree in every forest, in the dark and the quiet and the cold. And it has been happening, without interruption, for longer than our species has existed to wonder about it. Some of those bacteria do something quietly extraordinary. They take nitrogen directly from the air, from the spaces between soil particles, and convert it into a form the tree can use. Atmospheric nitrogen is abundant, but in its raw form, it is locked away, chemically inert, unavailable to most living things. These bacteria carry an enzyme that can break that lock. And so the tree, through its roots, through the compounds it releases into the rhizosphere, draws these bacteria close, not through any conscious act, but through chemistry that has been refined over hundreds of millions of years of proximity. The nitrogen those bacteria fix does not stay only with the tree. It enters the fungal threads as well. It moves through the network. It becomes part of the shared resource that flows between connected trees. A single breath of air contains more nitrogen than most forest soils can easily provide, and yet the forest finds a way. Through this three-way arrangement, tree, fungus, bacterium, it pulls what it needs from the very air between its roots. This is the partnership that sustains a forest, not one relationship, but many, layered and interlocking. The tree provides carbon, the fungus provides minerals and reach. The bacteria provide nitrogen. Each depends on the others in ways that took a very long time to understand, and that we are still, in many respects, only beginning to map. And then there are the earthworms. They move through the soil slowly, taking it in, passing it through their bodies, leaving it changed behind them. What they leave is looser, more porous, better aerated. Soil that earthworms have worked through holds water differently. It has more space between its particles, and in those spaces, fungal threads can spread. Without that physical structure, the network struggles. Compacted soil, soil pressed tight by weight or disturbance, closes off the tiny passages that mycelium needs to travel. Earthworms are, in a sense, the architects of the space the network inhabits. Remove them, and the network loses the medium through which it moves. This is how disturbance compounds. You remove the earthworms, and the soil compacts. The soil compacts, and the fungal threads cannot spread. The fungal threads cannot spread, and the trees lose their connections. The trees lose their connections, and the seedlings struggle. Each loss enables the next. The forest does not collapse all at once. It thins quietly from below. There is something worth pausing on here. The idea that a forest is a community, not a collection of separate, competing individuals, but a living system of relationships. This idea did not begin with Western science. It did not begin in a laboratory, or with a radioactive carbon tracer, or with a paper published in a journal in 1997. It was known before. Many indigenous peoples who have lived in and with forests for generations held this understanding as a foundation of their relationship with the land. The forest was not a resource to be extracted from. It was a community to be lived within. The trees were not separate. The soil was not inert. The relationships between living things were not incidental. They were the point. In British Columbia, where much of the foundational mycorrhizal research has been conducted, the forests have been home to indigenous peoples for thousands of years. Their ecological knowledge, accumulated through generations of careful observation and relationship, recognized the interconnectedness that scientists would later work to measure and quantify. Suzanne Simard, whose research did so much to bring the mycorrhizal network into scientific focus, has written about this alignment, about the way her findings resonated with knowledge that had existed long before her experiments. The science did not discover something new so much as it found a new language for something that had already been understood in a different way, through a different kind of attention. That is worth holding gently. The scientific study of mycorrhizal networks is, by the standards of the forest itself, very young. Most of the key discoveries have been made since the 1990s. A few decades of research, set against 450 million years of relationship. We are newcomers to this understanding. Before the 1990s, the dominant model in forest ecology emphasized competition. Trees competed for light, for water, for nutrients. The forest was understood primarily as a place of struggle, where individual trees succeeded or failed based on their own capacities. This was not wrong. Exactly. Competition is real. It happens every day in every forest, but it was incomplete. The network was there all along. The carbon was flowing. The signals were traveling. The seedlings were being sustained by connections that no one had yet traced. The forest was cooperating, quietly, beneath the model that said it was only competing. In 1997, a paper appeared in the journal Nature. It was authored by Suzanne Simard and her colleagues, and it presented direct evidence of carbon transfer between trees through mycorrhizal networks in a Douglas fir forest. It showed, with radioactive tracers, that carbon fixed by one tree could travel underground and appear in a neighboring tree. That the boundary between one organism and another was not as clear as the dominant model assumed. The paper did not resolve every question. Science rarely works that way, but it shifted something. It opened a door that had been, if not closed, at least overlooked. And through that door, in the years that followed, came a great deal of careful work. More tracers, more measurements, more species, more forests. All of it slowly filling in the picture of a world beneath the world. A world that indigenous knowledge had, in its own way, already described. There is a kind of humility available in this history. If we are willing to receive it, the forest kept its own record. The relationships persisted whether or not anyone with a laboratory was paying attention. The network did not wait to be discovered. It simply continued, as it had for hundreds of millions of years, doing what it does. And what it does is hold things together. Not through intention, not through anything we would recognize as care in the way we use that word, but through chemistry and physics and the slow accumulation of relationships so old they predate the trees themselves. The fungus was here before the forest. The partnerships were forming before there were forests to form them in. What we are looking at when we look at a mycorrhizal network is one of the oldest continuous arrangements of living things on this planet. It does not ask to be understood. It does not need our attention to function. But there is something that happens when we do pay attention. Something that quiets the part of us that sees the world as a collection of separate things. The tree is not alone. The seedling is not alone. Even the soil is not alone. Everything, it turns out, is in relationship with something else. And the forest has known this, if knowing is even the right word, for longer than we have been here to ask the question. And yet the forest is not only cooperation. That is worth holding for a moment. The network, ancient, intricate, quietly sustaining, exists alongside something else entirely, something that pulls in the opposite direction. Competition. A tree reaches upward for light. Its neighbor reaches upward for the same light, the same patch of sky, the same angle of afternoon sun filtering through the canopy. There is no sharing of that. Each crown expands into whatever space it can find, and where two crowns meet, there is a boundary, not negotiated, not agreed upon, simply arrived at through the slow pressure of growth against growth. Above ground, the forest is a place of quiet contest. And below ground, those same trees are threaded together. The same two trees whose canopies press against each other in competition may have their roots woven into a shared fungal network, exchanging carbon and minerals in the dark. One dynamic does not cancel the other. They simply operate at different scales, in different directions, at the same time. This is one of the more quietly remarkable things about a forest. It holds both. Competition and cooperation, running simultaneously like two rivers moving through the same landscape without merging. The tree does not choose one or the other. It does both, because the conditions above ground and the conditions below ground ask for different things. Above, scarcity of light drives separation. Below, the chemistry of soil drives connection. The forest is shaped by both forces at once, and what emerges from that tension is something more stable than either force alone could produce. Researchers who study forest ecology sometimes speak of this dual dynamic as one of the field's more humbling discoveries. For a long time, the dominant model was competition. Trees as rivals, each striving against the others for resources. That model was not wrong. It simply was not complete. The network did not replace the competition in the story. It added another layer beneath it, literally and figuratively. The forest is more than one thing at a time, and the network itself is more layered than it first appears. When we think of roots, we tend to think of them as shallow, spreading outward just beneath the surface, threading through the topsoil. And for many trees, that is largely true. But the fungal threads that extend from those roots do not always stay near the surface. The depth of a mycorrhizal network varies considerably from one forest to another. In some forests, the fungal threads are concentrated in the upper few centimeters of soil, where organic matter is richest and moisture is most available. In others, the network descends much further, several meters down, into layers of soil that roots alone would rarely reach. In some forests, fungal threads have been found at depths that surprise the researchers who found them, far below the main root zone, in soil that seems, on the surface, too dense and too mineral poor to support much life. And yet the threads are there. What are they doing that far down? One possibility is water. During drought, the upper layers of soil dry out first, the moisture retreats downward into deeper strata where the sun's heat cannot reach it. A tree whose fungal network extends into those deeper layers may be able to access that moisture when the surface is dry. Not directly, the tree's own roots may not go that deep, but through the fungal threads, which can move water upward through the network and deliver it where it is needed. This may be part of why old-growth forests tend to survive drought conditions that younger forests struggle with. Old-growth forests have had centuries to build their networks. The fungal threads have had time to descend, to branch, to find the deeper moisture and the deeper minerals. The network is not just wide, it is deep. And that depth becomes a kind of resilience when the surface world turns dry and difficult. Young plantation forests do not have this. A forest planted after clear-cutting starts with shallow roots and limited fungal diversity. The species that colonize first are not always the most beneficial. The deep networks have not yet formed. The connections between trees are few and recent. When drought arrives, these forests have less to draw on. They are more vulnerable, not because the individual trees are weaker, but because the system beneath them is still young. This is one of the quieter arguments for protecting what already exists. A young forest is not the same as an old one. Even if the trees look similar from a distance, the difference is underground, in the depth and complexity of what has accumulated over time. That complexity cannot be replanted. It can only be grown, slowly, over decades and centuries. Forest managers have begun to take this seriously. The science of mycorrhizal networks has moved, gradually, from research papers into practice, into the decisions made about how forests are harvested and what is left behind when they are. One approach is called retention forestry. Rather than clearing an entire area, some old trees are left standing. Not many, sometimes just a handful per hectare. But those trees carry something with them that the cleared ground no longer has. Their roots are still alive. Their fungal networks are still intact, and those networks can serve as anchors for the recovery of the surrounding forest. A single old tree, left standing in a harvested area, is not simply one tree. It is a node in a network that still functions, a point from which fungal threads can spread outward into the disturbed soil, connecting with the roots of new seedlings as they emerge, offering them what the seedlings cannot yet build for themselves: access to nutrients, to water, to the chemical signals that help a young tree understand its environment. Even a small number of retained trees can make a measurable difference to the recovery of the forest around them. But recovery takes time. This is perhaps the most important thing the science of mycorrhizal networks has to say to the people who manage forests. The time required for a network to fully recover after clear cutting is not measured in years. It is measured in decades. Some researchers believe that full recovery in a temperate forest may take a century or more. A century. The trees planted today may be mature before the network beneath them resembles what was there before. That is not a reason for despair. Forests do recover, networks do rebuild, but it is a reason for honesty about what is lost when an old forest is cleared and how long the accounting runs. The network does not reset quickly. It does not forget what it was, exactly, but it loses the depth, the diversity, the accumulated connections of centuries, and rebuilding those connections is slow work, done in the dark, one thread at a time. The forest above ground can look recovered long before the forest below ground is, and so the trees grow. Above ground, reaching for light, pressing against each other in the quiet competition of canopies. Below ground, threading together through the fungal network, sharing what the soil holds. Both things at once. Both things, always. The network descends into the earth, deeper than we might expect. Patient, unhurried, doing the slow work of connection in the dark. As it has, in one form or another, for longer than we have words to describe. And so the question settles, quietly, into the soil. Not just how long recovery takes, but what exactly is being lost while the waiting happens. Because beneath an old-growth forest, there is something that cannot be replanted. You can put a seedling in the ground, You can water it, tend it, give it time. But what lies beneath an ancient forest, the accumulated carbon, the layered connections, the depth of centuries of exchange that cannot be restored on any human schedule. The carbon stored in old-growth fungal networks is, as far as researchers can tell, significant, quietly, enormously significant. Mycorrhizal fungi hold carbon not just in their threads, but in the compounds they produce, the structures they build, the organic matter they bind into the soil. This carbon does not move quickly. It settles. It accumulates. Over decades, over centuries, it becomes part of the deep architecture of the forest floor. Some estimates suggest that mycorrhizal fungi, taken together across the world's forests, store carbon equivalent to several years of human carbon dioxide emissions. Several years. That figure carries uncertainty. Researchers are careful to say so. The precise number is difficult to measure because the network is difficult to see, and what cannot be seen cannot easily be counted. But the scale, even with that uncertainty, is large enough to matter. Large enough that scientists working on global carbon accounting are now asking how to include it. Incorporating fungal network carbon into climate models is an active area of research. It is not yet standard practice. The models that describe how much carbon forests hold have, until recently, focused on the trees themselves, their trunks, their branches, their leaves. The underground portion, the living web of fungi that makes those trees possible, has often been left out of the calculation. That is beginning to change. Slowly, as the science deepens, the models are being asked to look downward, to account for what the soil holds, to recognize that a forest is not only what stands above the ground. And this is one of the quieter arguments for protecting old-growth forests rather than replacing them with plantations. Not only the trees themselves, but the carbon locked in the ancient networks beneath them. Carbon that took centuries to accumulate. Carbon that, once released, does not return on any timescale that matters to a living forest. Protecting an old forest is, in part, protecting a carbon archive, one that has been building, thread by thread, since long before anyone thought to measure it. There is a particular way of seeing a forest that changes once you know what lies beneath it. From above, from a hillside, from the window of a plane, from the edge of a clearing, a forest looks like a collection of separate things, individual crowns, each one distinct, gaps of sky between them. One tree here, another there, each standing in its own space. But that view is only half the picture. Below ground, the boundary between one tree and another dissolves. The roots reach outward and meet the fungal threads, and the threads reach further still. And somewhere in the dark soil, they connect to the roots of another tree, and another, until what looked like a collection of individuals becomes something else entirely. A web, a shared body, a single system with many crowns. The oldest trees in a forest have had the most time to build these connections. Their networks are the deepest, the most extensive, the most richly branched. Decades of exchange have woven them into the center of the forest's underground life. They are not simply old trees. They are the most connected points in a network that the whole forest depends on. And when one of those old trees reaches the end of its life naturally, when it slows and thins and finally falls, the forest receives what it held. Slowly, carbon that was fixed from the air over a century or more begins to move back through the network, through the fungal threads, through the soil, through the slow work of decomposition. It does not vanish. It transforms. It becomes available to the roots of neighboring trees, to the seedlings waiting in the understory, to the soil itself. A natural death in a forest is a long, unhurried release. The tree gives back what it gathered, over years, over decades. The network absorbs it. The forest continues. But when an old tree is cut, when it ends not through the slow unwinding of age, but through a single, sudden severance, the carbon it held does not move through the network. It moves into the air, rapidly, by the standards of a forest. A different kind of ending, with different consequences for everything connected to it. The wood may be used, and some of that carbon may be stored for a time in buildings or furniture, but the roots decay, the fungal connections are severed, and the deep carbon that had been accumulating in the soil around that tree begins to shift. The archive is interrupted. And the network responds. Not with anything we would call awareness. The forest does not mourn in any way we can measure, but the connections that ran through that tree, the flows of carbon and phosphorus and chemical signal that passed through its roots and out into the surrounding web, those connections are now absent, and the network adjusts. Flows reroute. Neighboring trees that have been receiving resources through that hub find the supply changed. Some connections weaken. Others, perhaps, strengthen elsewhere as the network seeks new paths. After the loss of a hub tree, neighboring trees sometimes show measurable changes in their own growth and chemistry. Their rings may narrow. Their defensive compounds may shift. The chemistry of the soil around them changes in ways that researchers are still working to understand. Whether this constitutes a response to loss, in any meaningful sense, or simply a mechanical adjustment to changed conditions, that is an open question. Science is careful here, and the carefulness is right. The language of grief and awareness, when applied to trees, requires more evidence than we currently have. But the measurable changes are real, the altered growth is real, the rerouted flows are real. Something in the network registers the absence, not as feeling, as far as we know, but as a shift in the chemistry of the soil, in the distribution of resources, in the quiet arithmetic of what flows where. A forest, seen from above, is a collection of crowns. Seen from below, seen truly, it is something older and stranger and more continuous than that. It is a network that has been building since before these trees were born, since before the forest that stood here before them, threading through the soil in the dark, connecting what grows above it into something that is, in some quiet and unmistakable way, more than the sum of its parts. The oldest threads in that network have been there longer than any living thing above ground. They hold the forest together. They hold its carbon, its memory of exchange, its accumulated record of what has grown here and what has passed through and what has been given and received across centuries of slow, unhurried life. And they continue. In the dark, below the roots, below the reach of light, doing the work that has always been done here, quietly. And that question, whether it is response or mere mechanics, may never be fully resolved. Science does not always arrive at clean answers. Sometimes it arrives at a more honest place, the edge of what can be measured, where the instruments stop and the uncertainty begins. That edge is not a failure. It is where careful thinking lies. The scientists who study these networks are precise about what they have found and cautious about what they have not. They have measured carbon moving between trees. They have traced chemical signals traveling through fungal threads. They have watched seedlings survive conditions that should have killed them, sustained by flows from trees they had never touched. These things are documented, repeatable, real. What those flows mean, whether there's anything it is like to be a tree sending carbon to its offspring, whether the network carries anything resembling intention, that remains, honestly, unknown. And the honest answer is, we do not know. We may not have the tools to know. The word grief belongs to creatures with nervous systems, with memory, with the experience of absence. Whether a tree has anything like that experience is a question that current science cannot answer. Not because the question is unimportant, but because the methods for answering it do not yet exist, and perhaps cannot exist in the form we would need. So, science holds the word back. And that restraint is not coldness. It is a kind of respect, a refusal to project what is familiar onto what is genuinely strange. Because the forest is genuinely strange. Not strange in a way that unsettles, strange in the way that very old things are strange when you sit with them long enough. Strange in the way that something vast and quiet and older than your understanding of it can be strange. A network that has been threading through the soil for 450 million years does not need our metaphors to be remarkable. It simply is what it is. And what it is this. Threads, finer than roots, moving through the dark between soil particles, carrying phosphorus toward roots that need it, carrying carbon towards seedlings that cannot yet make enough of their own, carrying chemical traces of damage, of drought, of the slow distress of a neighbor, not as language, not as intention, but as chemistry, moving through a living medium, arriving somewhere, changing something. The mother tree at the center of the network does not know it is a mother tree. It does not know anything, as far as we can tell. And yet the carbon flows toward the seedlings. The signal travels when the bark beetle arrives. The young trees at the edge of the canopy receive what they need from somewhere below, from something they are connected to without knowing they are connected. The network does not require awareness to function. It has been functioning since before awareness existed on this planet. That is, in its own quiet way, one of the more settling things about it. It does not depend on anyone understanding it. It does not depend on being observed or named or studied. It was doing this work in the Devonian, when the first small plants were feeling their way across bare rock, with fungal partners already threaded through their roots. It was doing this work before there were forests, before there were animals to walk through them, before there was anyone to look up at the canopy and wonder what was happening below. It simply continued, as it continues now. Below the forest you might be near, or the forest you might be thinking of, or the forest that exists somewhere in the part of your mind that holds the memory of trees. Below all of that, the threads are there, moving slowly through the soil, doing what they have always done. There is something in that continuity that is worth resting in for a moment, not as a lesson, not as a conclusion, just as a fact, held quietly. The network is older than the trees it connects, older than the species of trees it connects. It has outlasted individual forests, individual climates, individual extinctions. It has adapted and contracted and spread again. It has persisted through conditions that ended many other things. And it persists now, in the soil beneath old-growth forests where the threads run deepest, in the recovering soil of forests that were cut and are slowly rebuilding their connections, in the degraded soil where the network is thin and struggling and waiting for conditions to improve. It persists in the dark, where it has always lived, where light does not reach and seasons are felt only as changes in what flows down from above, where the work is chemical and slow and continuous, where nothing is announced. The forest above is full of events, leaves turning, light shifting, wind moving through the canopy in long, slow waves, birds passing through, rain arriving and soaking down through the layers of the forest floor. Below, the network receives all of this as information, as changes in what is available, what is needed, what should flow, and where. It adjusts without deciding to adjust. It simply responds to what is. The way water responds to the shape of the ground, it moves across. And the forest, because of that response, holds together. The seedling in the deep shade survives another season. The tree stressed by drought receives a small adjustment in what its neighbors draw from the shared water below. The damaged tree sends its signal outward, and the neighbors, without knowing why, begin to prepare. None of them know. And the forest holds. That is what remains, after the careful language has done its work, after the qualifications and the uncertainties and the honest acknowledgement of what is not yet known. What remains is the network itself. Ancient, quiet, still doing what it has always done. You do not need to understand it fully to rest in the fact of it. It does not require your understanding. It only requires the soil and the roots and the slow passage of time, all of which it has. all of which it has always had. The threads move through the dark below the roots, below the reach of any light, carrying what needs to be carried, connecting what grows above into something continuous, something that has been continuous for longer than the mind easily holds. And somewhere in that network, in the soil of some old forest, a thread is moving now, slowly, through the dark, toward a root it has not yet reached, carrying something quietly.